Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. If you're listening when this episode has just come out, let me wish you a happy new year. I'm starting 2025 with an episode that continues my occasional series looking at something that's of particular interest to me, the German football Bundesliga. If you're a football fan, that's soccer for American listeners, or have an interest in Germany, there's an obvious reason to listen. But even if you're neither of those things, this episode might well surprise you because it's far more about what happens off the pitch than on it. My guest is Kit Holden, a British-German author and journalist based in Berlin. He covers football for Der Tagesspiegel and AFP, and has also written for The Athletic, Guardian and Die Zeit. While he is a sports journalist, he also explores the dynamics around the game. So in his writing and on the show, there are insights into society, fandom, and when tradition meets commercialization. As well as reporting on the Bundesliga, Kit is the author of two books. The first was Scheiße, We're Going Up, the tale of Kit's adopted team Union Berlin, a former East German club which battled survival and finally managed against all the odds to rise to the Bundesliga and the Champions League. The second, released last year in time for the European Championships which took place in Germany, called Played in Germany, a footballing journey through a nation's soul, is about as revealing as the country as it is the sport. In our discussion, we talk about both. We explore what makes the Bundesliga so different from other leagues, from its fan-focused ownership structures to the way it intertwines with regional and national identities. We look at some of the dynamics that underpin the sport, the economics of it, the fan cultures, and the challenges of maintaining tradition and the in-stadium experience in a sport that's also seeking to reach a global audience. We also explore how Kit approaches his craft as a journalist and how being an insider-outsider helps him ask questions that uncover unique perspectives and stories, and how his curiosity drives him to connect with people and bring their experiences to life. You'll hear about the 50+1 rule, and for anyone unfamiliar with that, this is simply a rule that means fans have to own 50% plus one of the club's shares, thus preventing anyone from taking over football clubs in the way that we've seen in other countries. So whether you're a football fanatic, a curious newcomer, or someone interested in how sport reflects society and the art of storytelling, this episode will offer you insights and surprises. It's my discussion with Kit Holden on Played in Germany, a footballing journey through a nation's soul. Kit, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here because we're going to talk about a subject that I spend a lot of my time thinking about and enjoying. Before we get to that, tell us a little bit about you. How is it that a Brit comes to end up in Germany writing in both English and German about German football?
Yeah, it's interesting. We were just chatting about your story with Bayern Munich, and in some ways I think we have something in common there, because I too became a Bayern fan pretty much out of spite or contrariness. I was my cousins who grew up in Munich, and I got a Bayern shirt when I was a kid, and so that sort of started the journey. And then about a year after that, it was the 1999 Champions League final, and I was the only kid in my class, or probably in the entirety of Southern England at that point, who supported Bayern, and was obviously devastated watching on the living room floor of my home in Northampton at the time. And my father, who is not a Man United fan at all and taught me to be very sceptical of Man United, was so amazed by the turnaround that he was celebrating as if it was his own team, and I was bawling my eyes out, and got mercilessly ribbed the next morning in school. And I think that sort of solidified very early in me, first of all, an affection for Bayern, and then generally a kind of affection for German football. And yeah, it just sort of it was something that I continued having all my life. And in the end, I studied German. I did a year abroad working at a German newspaper in Berlin, and yeah, fell in love with the city, and yeah, the rest is history, I suppose.
The thing that is fascinating for me is in your journalism, you're not just looking about what happens on the pitch, but you're also thinking more broadly. And I guess one of the appeals for me of the Bundesliga is that it feels a little bit closer to society because of the ownership structures and the strength of voices the fans have.
Yeah, I think, especially writing from the point of view of writing in English about Germany, I think a lot of the reason that people are interested in German football is exactly that, the fan culture, and from the very kind of basic stuff like the ownership models and 50+1 right up to the deeper stuff and the kind of way. And I've always been interested in the way that, people talk about 50+1, and it is important, and it's an important safety net, I think, for fan power in German football, but it isn't the kind of be all and end all. It's not the thing which guarantees all of German fan culture. It is a safety net. It stops it all being torn apart, but it's not the kind of, in and of itself, it's quite a kind of sinful rule. And actually, German fan culture is built much more on people who give up a lot of their free time to get involved in their local club, defend the rights of fans. Often unpaid, often without much adulation, without much reward beyond simply caring about what they do. And I think that's in some ways a kind of a slightly underestimated part of German fan culture, and one which I'm always interested in. And yeah, I think people are interested in that. I think it's particularly in the last 10, 20 years, say, in the way that English football has developed, Spanish football has developed. I think Germany is seen by a lot of people as a kind of alternative model, whereby you can kind of have super clubs like Bayern and Dortmund, who are European giants, and you can potentially win the Champions League or European trophies, but they don't necessarily have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, yeah, we're getting Saudi Arabia or Roman Abramovich or whoever it is to buy us all that success. There is still a kind of compromise between success and soul in Germany, which I think a lot of fans in England and Spain and other countries look to. Yeah, with a certain amount, I wouldn't say jealousy, but with a certain amount of, okay, if they can do it, then why can't we? And I think that's what people are interested in much more than, who's playing left back for Bayer Leverkusen in mid-November. It's sad to say, because I'm interested in that too, but,
You started off by writing, so you write for various esteemed publications, many of which I subscribe to, but you then write your first book about Union Berlin, and it's a very interesting club in the history that it has, and the fact that the fans have built their own stadium and have literally given blood for the club. It seems that it's a very unique thing. Was your ability to write that book, I presume, those dynamics really played into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sort of adopted Berlin Union as my second German club when I moved to Berlin 12 years ago almost now, which is crazy. And
wow,
yeah, as I say, I was a Bayern fan, but I thought, well, I'll go and watch my local club, and sort of fell in love with them for that reason. I mean, in some ways, I was a West Ham fan as well growing up, and in some ways, it kind of coincided with falling out of love a bit with West Ham amid all the kind of Olympic Stadium and all this stuff that happened around then, with West Ham and Union kind of almost slotted themselves perfectly as a kind of east of the city, down to earth, forever luckless club, with an amazing, atmospheric square stadium and all the rest of it. And they kind of had everything that I thought was being lost at West Ham, Union had. And yeah, I fell in love with them in their own right over the years watching them, and yeah, I always say I thought for ages, well, this story has been told. In many ways, it had been told in English as well. There've been lots of articles and documentaries and stuff done about Union and fantastic stuff done, but nobody had done the book. And it is, as you say, it's such an amazing story, partly just because of the way what the fans achieved in that 20-year period, where, yeah, as you say, they built their own stadium. They gave blood to save the club from bankruptcy. They pulled all kinds of stunts in the 90s to save the club from bankruptcy. I mean, it's a real story of complete and utter, sometimes bordering on the insane dedication to your local football club, of which they are very proud, and rightly so. And they did save a club which otherwise would have gone, bust and ceased to exist, and that would have been that. And that was the basis for Union's current success. And I think that is quite a unique. I mean, you could argue at St. Pauli there's a similar story. There's a few other clubs where maybe that's happened across the world, but it's pretty rare that you get that level of desperation. The fans saved them, and now this level of success. But when I started writing, I thought, well, it's an amazing story anyway. And with Union's history, an East German club, what happens to them after the fall of the wall, there's a lot about their story which is very, very emblematic of the development of East German football and reunification in Germany per se. So there's a lot to kind of get your teeth into there. And I thought, well, somebody's got to write this book. And then when they got promoted in 2019, I thought, well, it's got to be now, because they'll be up for a year and then they'll go straight back down. And, this is the window to do it in. And yeah, I didn't do it in a year, but it turned out I was okay, because we got the Conference League and the Europa League and the Champions League, and yeah, so I was pretty jammy. And
is it easier for you as a non-German to write about these things as an outsider?
In some ways, yeah. I think, in some ways, writing both languages is sort of blessing and a curse, because you're always kind of repositioning yourself and trying to sort of remember exactly who your audience is. And particularly, I think with German football, where you do have this kind of, even in English language audiences, you have often a very, very well informed and quite dedicated audience. It's almost a kind of cult thing. That people who are interested in German football often know a lot about it, and so that kind of gives you a bit more freedom in that you don't have to explain first principles all the time. But that's also a challenge, because you're trying not to alienate the new reader or the newcomer as well, and so that's that was a challenge writing it. I think, what I tried to do was write something that was accessible for both those who know and German speakers and Germans, and would have something new for those people as well, but also was entirely understandable and approachable for people who knew nothing about football, weren't interested in football, but were purely interested in what is effectively a human story. And I think perhaps not being German is an advantage. I certainly think that the ability to pull yourself out of it, particularly when talking about issues like East and West, class issues in Germany, for example, the ability to be, even if it's not actually the case, because I've been living in Germany for 12 years and, I am German, and I in many ways am a member of that society, but having not grown up there, it not being my mother tongue, I think there is an element of you can distance yourself for a bit as a narrator and kind of attain more objectivity than, say, if I were a West German writing about an East German club. That there's an instant power dynamic there, which there is, to be fair, even as an English person, because I'm still a Westerner. But it's I think that being from another country perhaps allows a slightly more helicopter voice than it would if you're writing about them in German.
The conversations you have with people in your writing, they talk quite freely, and I wondered about that as well, whether you can build that rapport in a slightly different way, because you're, I guess, in the same way that your writing is coming from a more neutral, perceived to be a neutral position. I guess also the conversations when you're approaching it, you could potentially ask questions that wouldn't be viewed as being as loaded, and therefore people might open up more to you.
Yeah, I think so. And sometimes I think it's almost occasionally get the feeling it's almost a disadvantage to be able to interview someone in German, because they are then speaking their mother tongue, and they do kind of project onto you all those kind of loadednesses and prejudices that I might have as a West German, and that is sometimes a disadvantage. But I think, the fact that I was able to say, okay, look, I'm English, this is for English speakers, this book, and it's explaining a story largely from first principles to a certain extent. And I think more to the point, I mean, I was nervous when I started out with the interviews for the Union book, because I think there is a lot of, among many people, a certain reluctance to tell, not tell their story, but I think there's a certain wariness, partly because Union's story has been told from so many different perspectives, so many times. It's become cliched, it's become, canonized in a certain way, it's become canonized in ways which people don't necessarily agree with. There's a lot of stuff which is kind of part of the Union myth, which people inside the club kind of feel, well, that's a bit misunderstood, and it's become taken as read, and it's and I think people were slightly wary. But I think the key thing was just going in and saying, well, look, you tell your story. That's where we're starting from. We're not starting from, okay, well, Union are the St. Pauli of Berlin, or Union are left wing or right wing or whatever they are. I just want people to say what it means for them. And why they did the crazy things they did. And I think once you kind of start on that foot, then people are generally quite happy to tell their story, because, I think we're all like that. If someone comes and says, hey, tell me about, who you are, and then most of us are flattered enough to do it. So, and that was the impression I got. And I think, the kind of nervousness I had at the start quickly gave way into, oh, okay, this actually works very well. And also they're lovely people. I mean, all of them are, very, very nice people. So.
And you successfully published that with fabulous title, by the way. But that then prompts you to go and do the thing for Germany as a whole.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I'll admit, had it not been the Euros in Germany this year, I probably would have taken a bit more time on the second book. But there was I did have this feeling of, okay, there's a bit of momentum. We've got a tournament, in my country, in inverted commas, coming up. This is a good opportunity to do something similar. It was always going to have to be a little bit more of a shallower dive, shall we say, because simply time constraints and space constraints mean that. So it's a bit of a whistle stop tour. But yeah, I try to effectively do the same thing, which is go around the country and talk to people, whether it's fans or players or club presidents or whoever it is, about what football means to them, what it means to their identity, how it plays into their regional identities, how it plays into their idea of being German or being Bavarian and all these things. And I think, club football lends itself to that anyway, I think in all countries, because by definition, it's different regions playing against each other and articulating their identity through the colours and symbols of sport. And I think in Germany that's particularly the case, partly because I think you have a good spread. You have these different centres in Germany because it's the federal system. It's not that centralised. You've got, Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich, Hamburg. They're not necessarily all the same size in terms of population, but in terms of economic clout, cultural clout, they are quite equal. And I think that kind of reflects in football to a certain extent, albeit the Bundesliga is quite West heavy, but it's broadly speaking, there are big clubs round the corner in most areas of Germany with big fan bases and famous old stories. And that means you can sort of go around and cover most of the country through football and kind of get to grips with who people are, how they see themselves, and what their stories are.
You begin the book in Leipzig, which I was amazed to discover the history of football there and the importance about. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think, essentially the DFB, the German FA, as it is now, was founded in Leipzig, I think in 1900, 1900. It's always a bit of a gauntlet you run in your head when you have to pull these dates up off the top of your head and get them wrong. You're like a muppet. But no, it's 1900. And then a couple of years later, they have the first championship, national championship in Germany, and it's VfB Leipzig, who become Lok Leipzig later on and now Lok Leipzig again. But yeah, we're then VfB Leipzig. So yeah, the FA was founded in Leipzig. The first German champions are from Leipzig. It is and always was a very, very proud and important city in the history of German football, which is not to say that other cities and regions didn't have their role in founding German football. In some ways, it was coincidence that those two things kind of aligned, the fact that they chose to meet in Leipzig to found the FA and the fact that the first champion was from there. But it could have been Karlsruhe or any of these other kind of places where you've had pioneering clubs, Berlin, for example. But it was Leipzig, and Leipzig is very proud of that history. But because of the history of Germany, in the 100 years that followed, Leipzig sort of falls off the radar of German football's own story, because I think when German football begins to become a pop cultural phenomenon in the mid to late 20th century, German football becomes it as defined by West German football, because it's Franz Beckenbauer and it's Bayern Munich and it's the group Borussia Mönchengladbach and Günter Netzer and all those kind of great founding teams of the story of modern German football. That's all in the West, and once reunification happens, the continuity is in the West. So the Bundesliga continues to exist. The DFB, which moved from the East to the West when Germany was divided, continues to be the German FA. And so reunified Germany, all its structures and its history is in a continuous line with West Germany, going back to before the division. And East Germany's football history is kind of broken up because it was unified, it was part of the unified, and then it was divided and had a completely separate set of institutions and clubs for 40 years. And then they were kind of quite clumsily, you might argue, reintegrated into the Western system for reunified Germany, which leaves a city like Leipzig in a very strange situation, because it means in many ways often East German clubs will talk about how they're the only ones who have existed in all of Germany. They existed in the Kaiser era, they existed in Weimar and Nazi Germany, in reunified Germany, so the Federal Republic, and they existed in the GDR, and they're the only ones who can say they existed under all German states. But in actual fact, the story of German football as people perceive it is much more in the Western timeline. And I think that leads to it leads to a lot of things, but essentially it's a sense that the story of East German football is slightly discombobulated and one remove from the story of German football per se, which I think is particularly keenly felt in Leipzig, where you have that proud history, and now obviously a team which most people in the country hate and consider to be against the entire story of German football and the entire kind of ethos of it. And so it is. I mean, as you say, I wanted to start the book in Leipzig for that reason, because I think it gets to the heart of quite a lot of the things that define German football and Germany per se. If you start in Leipzig, and I was quite excited about doing that, and then got about halfway through planning and writing that first chapter. Why have I done this? Why didn't I just start with Lederhosen and Big Beers and Thomas Müller and
Well, I was going to say, because it's quite a complicated story to tell, and there's lots of things going on. And so, as you say, there would have been easier to want that. But I think that really sets the tone for how you're approaching the subject, which is to try and get underneath the skin of the obvious and really what's actually going on here. And as you say, the human story, that's why it's a great place to start, as opposed to some of what you might think of they'll be the easier stories to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in the end, I think I just about pulled it off. And I think having done that, it does make sense then, and it does, I think, allow the readers to kind of get to grips with the rest of Germany a lot more, because those basic things, the fact that this country was divided for half of the 20th century, the fact that has a lasting effect on public discourse, the economy, everything, politics, those things are established, and I think that's quite important, because quite often the story is told the other way around, where you tell the story of Germany with West Germany, and then halfway through you say, oh, and by the way, there was this thing in the East as well, which makes more sense as a storytelling, because the continuity is there in the West and not so much in the East. But it does mean that you do kind of relegate the East a bit, and I think it's important not to do that, because actually that's not how Germany works, and it's not how the country became what it is today.
To get the sorts of stories you have to, I guess, build rapport with people. And some of the people that you're talking to, obviously, they need to have the history. So we're looking at the older generations in terms of giving you that background. I presume that requires quite a lot of on-the-ground work in terms of conversations, building trust with them, that kind of thing. It's quite labour-intensive journalism, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about labour-intensive. I mean, there's a lot of interviews and a lot of, literally audio material that you have to break down into what is effectively maybe 15 quotes per person, and you've got an hour or two with each of them, which is, I guess, labor intensive. But it was so effectively I took the same approach as with the On Your Own book, where I just sort of went to people and said, tell me about stuff, tell me about how you feel about your city, your region, being German, your club, how all these things kind of interplay with each other. And some of them in Lothar Matthäus, for example, he gives 20 interviews a week, and he has his stories that he tells, and he tells them very well, and it's very efficient, and it's 25 minutes with him, and that's that's great, and he has a lot to say, but he knows about being interviewed, and so because he's doing it all the time. So and then other people who maybe aren't used to telling their story, you spend a lot more time with them, because it's just natural, you allow them, and I did purposefully allow people to ramble. Often people go, "Is this interesting to you?" If they're talking about something, I was like, "Yeah, it might not make it in, but it is all very important, because it's even the stuff you don't put in informs also what you are saying, and your own sensitivity as a writer to what people care about, what they're afraid of, what they see as the kind of common errors about when people write about their city or their club. And so, there's a lot of long interviews, but I really enjoy that. And I think, as with the unknown book, I think most people kind of enjoy that as well, the chance to just chat for a bit about their football club, because, they love it and it's part of their identity.
You've talked before about the fact that there isn't that one single capital, and that the federal model really comes out, which allows you to, I guess, to approach it from a regional perspective in some respects, because there are interesting stories out there. You haven't got the same thing you have in the UK, where tons of clubs in London. I guess much more variety for you to be able to write about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. To be honest, I don't really know the UK as well as I know Germany in that sense, in terms of regional identities and stuff like that, because I haven't studied it in the same way. It's my country, and so you kind of everything's just normal and neutral, and then you go out into the world. But I think you probably could find that in the UK. To be fair, I think if you were to apply the same logic and go to the northeast, and then go to Manchester and Liverpool, and then go to the Midlands and all across the country, you would find very, very different histories and identities that are kind of expressed through football. But I think perhaps they're easier to kind of grasp hold of in Germany because people are potentially more in touch with them because of the lack of centralization. I mean, the very fact that everyone's in a federal state, that federal state in most cases is in some way linked to some kind of traditional region or kingdom. I mean, there are some that are a bit more botched together of two or three, but those kind of identities, they're simultaneously often bureaucratic, day-to-day logistical identities because you go to the state institutions of Hesse or Bavaria or wherever it is, and also there is clearly a cultural thing that goes back a lot longer and goes through German history, and therefore, I think perhaps it's easier for German fans to kind of articulate those identities in football, and you see that very much so. I mean, in the badges, in the dialects that they use for songs in the stadium, and all those things, they are using identities, assuming identities, keeping alive identities, which are very much a product of not just federalism, but the fact that Germany was always a kind of mishmash of smaller regions and kingdoms and all the rest of it, and we never really had a kind of monolithic center which would kind of draw everyone into it. I mean, that's Fulda geographically, which clearly is not the case. And I think that's perhaps easier for German fans to articulate than maybe for others. But then, that might be sort of slightly reverse engineering it in that they've just been doing that for 30 years, and so that's what they've latched onto. And actually, if you had the same ultra movement in English football, then maybe people would be kind of more into their identity as Black country people or right. West country people or whatever. So but I think certainly regionalism, just looking at Germany in and of itself, I think is a huge part of understanding how that society works and how the country works as a whole. And there isn't really a neutral German space. I mean, but I think perhaps people talk about Hanover as linguistically the kind of accentless German, the equivalent of Florentine Italian or I guess the Queen's English, but that's slightly more kind of class based. But culturally, I don't think there's any space which doesn't have its own kind of defined idea of regional identity, and that may be something which sort of ebbs away over time as well, because I think in many ways the difference between somebody in the Rhineland and the Ruhr now is not very much. Effectively, those people, if you're in Cologne or Dortmund, you're effectively part of one big modern megacity in effect, because there's trains that link all those kind of traditional cities, and you could sort of see it as one of those Chinese cities where it's 5 cities in one, and they have even tried to do an Olympic bid on that basis, and that in many ways makes much more sense in the modern world. But by the same token, the difference between somebody in the Ruhr and the difference between somebody in southern Bavaria and Alpine Bavaria or Stuttgart or wherever, and you even see it in tiny borders, the very, very clear distinctions people make between being from Baden or being from Swabia. No, we're totally different people. So everyone else in the country is like, yeah, you've got funny accents, and you're in the forest down there, and they're like, no, we're completely different. Like, our dialects are completely different. Our food is different. Our attitude is different. I think that's very much part of Germany, and it's part of the fun as well. It's nice going on away trips or going to different stadiums and seeing things. And I always joke, there's a certain narcissism of small differences where you go to people and you say, what makes your region so unique? And they say, well, we've got this great beer and this great sausage, and we're really, really...
You won't find this anywhere else. Which is true, right? You won't find the literal thing, but the format is exactly the same way of answering the question.
But I think that is... I like that as well. I like the fact that you go anywhere in Germany and they will have, an idea of who they are and why they are who they are because of their city or their region. And they're all very proud of it, and that's kind of nice, because it does feel like you're kind of discovering stuff wherever you go.
It struck me that football in Germany was, the tradition plays a key role, and you make the point in the book that you're unlikely to see national flags. You're much more likely to see club banners and emblems, and it struck me that actually football is an interesting way for people to be able to keep hold of bits of the past without having to necessarily confront some of the more recent challenging periods.
Yeah, I mean, I would even argue it's almost the beauty of football is that it is more recent than the stuff, in Germany. I think the Federal Republic is built on the understanding culturally, or has been for a long time, the cultural understanding that, it's just always careful how you word it, because I think it's often misunderstood, and sometimes people talk about guilt complexes or atonement, and I don't think it's about that. I think it's about working through and facing what has been done in the name of this country and what the people of this country did, and how the Holocaust and World War II were such a product of German nationalism that you can't have German nationalism in the way that you have English nationalism, British nationalism, Spanish nationalism, whatever, because the entire project of German nationalism is so tied up with where it ended. And I think football, I certainly think regionalism is a way of, a lot of Germans would say that having a regional identity is a way of kind of feeling an identity without having to go full scale into the national identity, which is a bit more problematic. But I think also football it's a modern thing. It's a modern story of the country, which effectively begins post-war, because obviously the story goes back to the start of football in the late 19th century. But again, as a pop cultural phenomenon, as a mass thing that the whole country is interested in, it arguably starts 1954 in West Germany is the earliest it would start, probably in the 60s, and that's probably true of most countries as well. I mean, you have people going to football matches in large numbers in the first half of the 20th century, but it isn't on the TV in the same way. It isn't, such a part of the national conversation in the same way until the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then certainly in the 90s and 2000s it starts, going off the chart. And I think that means that football is a space in which you can talk about being German almost without having to talk about that story. And it's not that you don't have to talk about Nazism or the Holocaust, but it's a story of Germany from 1950 onwards, if that makes sense. And I think there are very few things where in German daily life where you can sort of absolutely say that. And at the same time, by the same token, most of those clubs did exist. Most of those clubs had their role to play, were part of the system, which were part of Nazi Germany, and therefore, by extension, there's a lot of the stuff, a lot of the work that people do in Germany to make sure that research work effectively, to make sure that remembrance is possible, and that the people aren't forgotten, that we understand exactly what role certain institutions or certain people played in the building of the Nazi state, in what in the complicity and the crimes and all the rest of it. That's something that happens across German society at small levels in terms of local communities, or at institutional levels in terms of big companies or state institutions. And in the last 30 years, it started happening at football clubs as well. And a lot of them, some have done much more than others, but a lot of them are now, a lot of the biggest clubs have now got, very, very good people researching the club's history and shining a light, and often a very difficult light. The case of Eintracht Frankfurt, where the president who effectively made Eintracht Frankfurt a great club in the middle of the 20th century, and took them to the first European Cup final and all the rest of it, turns out has a very, very problematic Nazi past, and they have to have this difficult process a few years ago where they decide, okay, do we posthumously remove the honorary presidency from this man, which they did. I think that's absolutely to their credit. And is also massively down to the work of not just, but the pioneering work of Matthias, who I spoke to in the book, the club historian. And I think that is, again, that's in many ways that story is you can see it as much more about, again, what Germany is post 1950 or post 1960 or post 1968. Most importantly, perhaps, in that this is Germans of later generations stepping up to that responsibility to make sure that the light is still shone on this, and that this is still understood, and this is still researched and part of the public discourse. And football clubs playing their role in that is also part of football being a story of modern Germany, I think.
And you talk in the book about the role of the ultras, which is a word that anybody who's not familiar with the Bundesliga might hear it and might just automatically think of football hooligans. But actually, there's quite a strong social element there, and the role that they play locally. And I think that's quite fascinating for me, because, again, I guess because of the ownership structure, have far more influence than they might do otherwise, but become very significant players. But that's not just for the clubs. They also have a social influence. And we see that happening when there are disasters or issues need to be addressed locally. That really plays itself out.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, I think that's true of ultra culture, across Europe. I mean, I think, seen groups of Spanish ultras in the last few weeks have been, organising collections for victims of the floods in Valencia and all that stuff. And I think that is very much a part of how many ultra groups see their role. That they have when you talk to ultras, they often talk about that. We have this ability to mobilise by definition, because that's what we do. We mobilise to create a big choreo tifo, whatever. We mobilise to protest against something. We mobilise to literally all be singing the same song in at the right time, whatever, to see off a player who we love, whatever it is. The ability to mobilise is absolutely their bread and butter. And so when they have an opportunity to do that in a way that goes beyond football and is something about society at large, then I think they do tend to take to that. And you saw that in the COVID pandemic as well, particularly in those first few months when lots of people are housebound. A lot of ultra groups across Germany are going around doing shopping for old ladies, that kind of thing, making masks, making sure people have got everything they need, which, a lot of other civil society groups are doing as well. It's not just the ultras, but it's about just stepping up into that role. And yeah, but I think in terms of football, I often, I think that perhaps the best way of thinking about them is, as I was saying earlier, I think 50+1 is the basic legal guarantee of German fan culture and fan power in Germany, but there is a kind of much bigger body politic that actually sustains all that above it. And in some ways, it's in that ecosystem. It's maybe useful to think of the ultras as sort of the kind of activist vanguard, if you like, who will always, they will tend to seek confrontation. They will tend to seek polemicization. But by doing so, they often create space for more substantial work, whether it's done by them or by other groups or a combination of the two. And I think most people in Germany, even if there are many ultra groups which people don't like and politically people aren't on board with, but I think ultradom as an idea and as a kind of a force in German football, I think most people do see the value of it. I think we saw that last season when there was this huge fight in German football over whether or not the DFL were going to get private equity investment into a subsidiary which would have sold media rights. And in many ways, in terms of English football, it's a tiny little thing that is nothing. And everybody would go, why are you bothered about that? But German fans, particularly ultras, saw it as the thin end of the wedge towards chipping away at fan power. And putting more power in the hands of private investors. And so they resisted. And they resisted to the point where they were almost bought. They were bringing games to a standstill for 30, 40 minutes at a time. And the league and the club bosses and the newspaper with the 4 letters, as they call it here, the biggest tabloid in Germany, made a concerted effort to paint that as this is a small group of extremists who are trying to protect their own patch. And they are not speaking for the majority of fans. But in actual fact, if you looked at the surveys and all the rest of it, most fans were saying, no, we agree with the ultras. We don't want this. We agree with the ultras. We don't think this is either necessary or being done in the right way. And we don't have a problem with these protests, even though it means, we go to the football and because they're throwing tennis balls on the pitch, we have to wait 40 minutes for it to kick off and it might get cancelled. There was a general support, not from everybody, but a majority support for their position, as hard as other people tried to paint it the opposite. And I think that says a lot. I think not everybody wants to be there on the Kurve, literally giving all their free time to supporting their club and waving flags and all the rest of it. And politically there is, depending on the club, always questions about what political direction a group of young men who are shouting at you and go in. That is absolutely all those things in each individual case are part of a discussion as well. And it's not that ultras are always universally popular, but I think people do see the value in it, and ultras are quite good, to be fair, I think, at communicating that as well. And I think I think that is misunderstood to a certain extent, that often people kind of see it as, oh, they're the extremists and the rest of the fans are sort of skeptical of them. But I think actually in most clubs there's a sense that no, we're all part of the same thing. We just have different roles in this ecosystem, if you like.
One of the things you beautifully bring out is the sense that, I guess, fans are treated like adults. So we don't have many of the restrictions that you have. So there's terraces. I mean, if I look at Dortmund, for example, the yellow wall, that's not a construct that you would be allowed to build nowadays under most health and safety rules. The alcohol is served in the stadiums. There's a very different vibe there. And also, I think that feeds through also in terms of when games are on. Yes, it's a media product, but it's less of a commercial. You don't have games on Monday nights because that's not too popular. So it feels very much like the in-stadium experience is very, very significant and guarded by fans. There is a huge amount of value placed on physically being at the game as opposed to being a media product. And that feels to me, and certainly this came through as you were talking about the different experiences in different stadia, feels like a very unusual, almost slightly old-fashioned experience that's being jealously guarded. And I wondered what you describe it beautifully. I wonder what your sense was in terms of the sustainability of that.
Yeah, and I think it's the $1 million question always at the heart of German football culture is, are they getting the balance right? On the one hand, you have a broad consensus that people want the Bundesliga to be competitive, and they don't want to completely fall off the radar and lose touch with the Premier League and La Liga and Serie A. On the other hand, they do see, most people, as I say, I think there is a majority support for protecting that culture and that idea of the stadium going fan being the first priority, and that reflecting that trust in terms of being able to stand, being able to drink beer, being able to smoke on the terraces. But it's also about ticket prices being affordable, all those things that make up essentially keeping football as something which still belongs to its fans and belongs to the direct community around the stadium and the club. And their interest being prioritised over the interests of even wealthier fans in the US or China or wherever it is. That's the sort of tension between those two priorities is very much an ongoing debate in German football, and one which, if you ask the board members at Dortmund or Bayern, they'll probably give you a very different answer to if you ask most people on the terraces at any club, including Dortmund and Bayern. And I think, last year's squabble over this private equity thing was indicative, I think, of that battle, and perhaps of it becoming ever more entrenched as well, and the kind of trust between the two sides breaking down ever more, because I think that the argument of those people who are saying, okay, we need to relax 50+1 a bit, or we need to bring in a bit more private investment, cut down fan power, is always that the Bundesliga will lose touch with the other leagues if it doesn't. Last season was kind of funny from that perspective, because the fans fought tooth and nail to stop the private equity investment coming in. We're told, the league will go to the dogs if we don't do this. They won. They got the league to back down, and then 3 months later, you have Bayern's dominance broken by one of the best young coaches in the world, most exciting title race for ages. You have a German club in the final of the Champions League, a German club in the final of the Europa League. Clearly this is not a league that is struggling to keep the pace, based on those metrics alone, right? And I think, aside from the fact that most fans would say, look, we don't care if Bayern are winning the Champions League or Dortmund are winning the Champions League, we care much more about the fact that we can still pay €20 to go to the game and have a beer. If the Bundesliga becomes a second-rung league, then so what? It's not about that. It's about our experience and our identities and our stories of these clubs. I think that the painting of it as a zero-sum game is something that comes much more from the top, from the people who are seeking to bring more private investment in and to loosen fan power a bit. I think most other people do see that, yes, there's a balance there to be struck 100%. And, and even at clubs, I mean, people talk about clubs like Union and St. Pauli, for example, as being anti-commercial or in some way anti-modern football. Whereas actually, if you talk to people at those clubs, what they all say is, no, we entirely operate within the realms of modern professional football, and we are a commercial beast, and we're going to sell as much merchandise as possible, and be a successful business in order to be a successful professional football club. We have no illusions about that or moral qualms about that at all. But we see also part of being a professional football club as protecting all the other stuff as well, and so you have to have a balance. And St. Pauli are trying that now with the idea of the Genossenschaft. Can't even the English word for Genossenschaft doesn't come into my head, but and Union, have come up with various ways of doing that in the past, and lots of other clubs as well. And I think there is just a sort of a broad consensus. I think that there is a balance to be struck, and that it can be struck without going too far in either direction. And then you have the two extremes kind of pushing it, and it is always a question of how long that kind of consensus can last, particularly when the people pushing it most tend to be the ones that have the most power in the game. But for now, last season was a good sign that fans are defending themselves pretty successfully, and that there is a broad consensus in favour of that.
As you toured the country, were there any things that surprised you as you got under the skin of the clubs in the regions?
Yeah, I don't think there was anything that sort of was completely new, because as I say, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the basics anyway, and much of that was familiar. But I think I did have, and I've been asked this question before, and I did have kind of moments where I thought, I'm getting this more. And I think, a good example is Schalke and Dortmund. In theory, that these are post-industrial cities with really, really proud identities, which are hugely tied to their football clubs, and their football clubs have always been a massive, massive part of what the city is. And you just need to go to either of those cities and see how ubiquitous, Schalke and BVB are. And you kind of know in theory that how much it means to people there. You've been to those grounds, and it's always great atmosphere and all the rest of it. But I think spending a bit more time and talking to people for a bit longer about the club and how it plays into their family histories, that their own personal stories, all the rest of it. Certainly at Schalke as well. I mean, Dortmund has all that, but it's much more well covered because Dortmund have been bigger in the last 10 years. But Schalke, I mean, everything is going wrong at that club that could possibly go wrong. Every Schalke fan would have every right to go, "You'd sod this," like it's all got lost, and we're just going to go and found FC Schalke 04 and be like AFC Wimbledon and do it that way. But when you're there, you really does kind of it brings it home to you just how much it really does mean. There's a lot of romance around the Royal football and how much it means for people in those cities, but the way people talk about it, the kind of almost the defiance of Schalke in the face of such a horrendous decade of terribleness, that it still moves them in the same way, and that it's still the kind of it's a very difficult thing to put into words, but I think I was, if not surprised, or it wasn't necessarily something new to me, but I think the extent of it and to actually feel it and to actually talk to people about it was something that did make me think, oh well, yeah, I get it a bit more now than I did before, than I thought I did, because it really does matter to people. It really is a massive, massive part of everything. As I say, their family, their local community, who they are, and the entire story of their community, and I think that's true of many clubs, but it really shines through in places like that.
I mean, that's an interesting example, right? Because they've had a torrid time on the pitch, but it's not just been a run of poor results. There's been a whole load of other issues with the club that they've had to contend with. So I guess the two things are interrelated, right? If you've got chaos within the club, it's unlikely to lead to success on the pitch. But that's a really interesting example, I think, of resilience of the model, and therefore when we talk about modernizing, whatever that might mean, you can see why, given that level of commitment, people want to stick with the traditions that are there, and there's resistance to change.
Yeah, and I think, Schalke in many ways is a very sad story what's happened in the last 10 years, because even Dortmund has if Borussia Dortmund weren't doing so well, it would be terrible for the city of Dortmund, but there's other stuff that Dortmund can do and has in its identity, whereas Schalke is, if you're a Hersfeld fan, for example, from a football perspective, it's been a miserable decade, but you're still from Hamburg. Hamburg's a exciting city where there's lots of stuff going on. Yeah, exactly. Whereas in Gelsenkirchen, it literally is Cole and Schalke 04, and Cole is long gone, and Schalke 04 are now entering a decline that for a long time seemed unfathomable, because they were always a giant of German football. And I think that in many ways is very sad. What I found very fascinating, and it was one of the most interesting conversations I had for the whole book, was my chat with Olivia Krasinski, who does sort of local tours around Gelsenkirchen, around the district of Schalke on match day. And it's from...
Yeah, that sounded brilliant. I just thought I must
and it's
really
absolutely
cool.
worth doing. And I'm not sure if he does them in English, but if you speak German, then it's 100% something that's worth doing. And he's a great guy and really, really fascinating. Could talk for hours and hours and hours about not just Schalke, but the history of the region and people and the communities. Very funny, very straight-talking guy. And his whole shtick was sort of saying, look, the football club matters because it is of that period of industrial growth and the golden age of Gelsenkirchen. It is only big because of that, and its story is so tied to coal. It's important that we use the football club to keep that memory alive and to remember that great tradition and our identity. But at the same time, that identity is a trap, and we need to also start articulating new ideas of what Gelsenkirchen is, because, as he saw it, the kind of fixation and romanticization of coal can be so extreme that it kind of doesn't leave any space for all, what he argues, a lot of other great stuff that is happening in Gelsenkirchen and things that economically or culturally or whatever are kind of developing, which often get overlooked because there is this, it's a sad place, it's a grim place, it's all this stuff. And he's saying, no, it's there, and we need to actually be a bit bolder about saying, no, this is Gelsenkirchen as it is now, and Schalke is also a part of this too. And I have a lot of respect for that, and I think it's probably wherever you are, not just in Gelsenkirchen, but the best way of going about it is yes, keep tradition, but also use that to articulate something going forward and to maintain something progressive, because otherwise you're just going to get lost in a kind of sepia tinted highlights reel. Do you remember the 70s, which is not good for football or anything. It was a fascinating story, because it's a guy going around telling you the story of the history of coal in this place and his family and all the rest of it. And you think, this is all about tradition and the Industrial Revolution and post-industrial decline and all the rest of it. And actually his whole thing is no, we to start thinking about what Gelsenkirchen is in the next 20 years and why it's the greenest city in Germany and all this stuff. And that's fascinating. And I think that's that kind of question of how you articulate, particularly in places like that where it is difficult to do so, and it's difficult to often obviously see the kind of reasons for optimism. There are also lots and lots of people on the ground doing that and working hard to do that as well. I think that's awesome.
Wow, love that. What's next on your projects? You've clearly, as I said, you could have written a book for each chapter or each club, let alone. So is there more to come from this particular project, or you got your eyes on something else?
I think a break. I've done 2 books in 3 years, which is it does take it out of you. So for the time being, I think a break. But yeah, probably at some point in the future there'll be another book coming along and another story to tell, whether it's Germany or something different.
Amazing. And for people that have not been to see a Bundesliga game, where would you recommend they start?
Union, obviously. That
was a loaded question.
Union is very special. If you can get in,
it's quite hard nowadays. It used to be a lot easier, and then all these documentaries and books have made.
Yeah, the Bundesliga effect kind of and Hertha going down, then did its thing, and then the Champions League effect kicked in as well, and so it's been the kind of exponential growth and therefore even growing difficulty in getting tickets. But it is still, when you're in there, the same as it ever was as well by the same token, and that's definitely something special. I mean, everywhere's special. I mean, they all have. I mean, maybe not. No offense, but maybe not Heidenheim or Hoffenheim or Wolfsburg. But there's, but St. Pauli is obviously fantastic for obvious reasons. But HSV is also one of the best atmospheres in Europe per se. And they're flailing around in the middle of the second division, and they're still mobilizing one of the loudest stadiums in the world. Frankfurt is fantastic match day experience. Dortmund obviously is. Gelsenkirchen is something else. There are so many fantastic grounds and fantastic clubs, and it's very rare if you were to say, apart from, as I say, maybe not Hoffenheim or Wolfsburg, but
I thought you were just going to go through a list of all the places, but you have at least positioned it relatively speaking. So I would, based on my experience, I would agree with that. Kit, thank you so much for writing an absolutely amazing book that really surprised me, but in a really positive sense, and has just made me more curious about things and wanted to know more. I spend enough time watching the games, but it's also joyous to be able to spend time reading about them and learning more around it, which increases my enjoyment of the game as well. So thank you for that. But above all, thank you for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Links to books and all the articles, of course, in the show notes, but thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Kit for appearing. To find out more about Kit and his writing, including his book Scheiße, We're Going Up about Union Berlin and Played in Germany, A Footballing Journey Through a Nation's Soul, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both of those there. If you want to learn more about the Bundesliga, then do also check out previous episodes featuring commentator Derek Ray and football journalist Raphael Honigstein. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you enjoyed this episode, please do consider leaving a review. It really helps others to discover the show. And for you to find episodes you might have missed, visit the show's website at humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thank you so much for listening.